Hey guys, EasyBisky here. I know all my videos have been Minecraft related so far, but honestly, those took a while to make, and I didn't have time to be on a server like that. So I thought I'd do something different and rank the first 3 Final Fantasy games. I recently played through all of them, and I thought it would be fun to rank them. So first off, how am I ranking them? There are 10 categories as of now. The best at each category gets the most points, the worst only gets 1. Since we're dealing with 3 games, the maximum points for each round is 3, which means the best score a game can receive is 30. Secondly, where can you get these games? I believe that all of them are available on iOS and Android, but there are other versions of the game that you should be aware of. For these rankings, I'm only going to be covering the original NES release, or, if it was never released in America, a fan translation of the Famicom version. But here are all the versions that are available. Final Fantasy I has been released on Famicom, NES, MSX2, Wonders 1 Color, PlayStation, Game Boy Advanced, and PlayStation Portable, in addition to iOS and Android. In my opinion, the PlayStation version, titled Final Fantasy Origins, is the best version of the game. If you would like me to cover why, let me know in the comments. Final Fantasy II has been released on Famicom, Wonders 1 Color, PlayStation, Game Boy Advanced, and PlayStation Portable, in addition to iOS and Android. Once again, I think that the PlayStation version, Final Fantasy Origins, is the best version, but if you want me to cover why, tell me in the comments. Final Fantasy III has been released on Famicom, DS, PlayStation Portable, Kindle Fire, Ouya, and Steam, in addition to iOS and Android. The original version is the best in my opinion, and as before, tell me in the comments if you want me to explain why. Back to the ranking system, what are the categories again? Music, story, graphics, gameplay, magic balance, battle balance, convenience, enjoyability, importance, and polish. First, music. It shouldn't be too surprising that the music got better as the series went on. The series composer Nobuo Uematsu took the Famicom to its limits time and time again in order to make the music as amazing as possible. Final Fantasy III gets first place because of this, Final Fantasy II gets second, and Final Fantasy I gets third. Scores will be located at the side of the screen. Next, story. During this era of gaming, video games typically didn't have stories, and if they did, they weren't fantastic. Final Fantasy I's backstory goes like this. The world is veiled in darkness. The wind stops, the sea is wild, and the earth begins to rot. The people wait, their only hope, a prophecy. When the world is in darkness, 4 warriors will come. After a long journey, 4 young warriors arrive, each holding an orb. And that's it. You get little tidbits of story throughout the rest of the game, but it's not great, at least by our standards. Final Fantasy II gets a little bit more interesting. The intro, as translated by Neo Demifor, states, "In a far-off land, a long peace has ended. The Paramekian Empire has summoned Hellspawn and hopes to rule the world. The people of Fynn fought bravely for their kingdom and lost. Now 4 of Finn's youth must flee to Altia, with the enemy just behind." You can already see that it throws you straight into the action, and unlike the first installment in the series, the story keeps going, even if it gets a bit nonsensical at some points. Finally, we have Final Fantasy III. The intro, as translated by A.W. Jackson, N. Corlett, and SOM2 Freak, says, "The Gurgan quietly spoke. This earthquake is but an omen. The tremors that pulled the crystal into the earth and brought forth monsters are nothing compared to the darkness that is to come. But hope is not yet lost. 4 souls take up the quest of the light, and so it begins. 4 orphans have been raised by the priest Topapa in the remote village of A crystal has sunk into the earth due to the earthquake, and the 4 boys have come in an adventurous mood. They had only intended to test their courage." Okay, am I the only person wondering what a Gurgan is? Sure, Final Fantasy III has a better story than the first installment of the series, but barely. And as such, the ranking here is Final Fantasy II in first place, Final Fantasy III in second place, and Final Fantasy I in last place. It's still early, folks, but it looks like the battle between 2 and 3 might be close. They both have 5 points right now. Coming up, graphics. Graphics happen to be in a similar vein as music. They got better as the games progressed, and as such, Final Fantasy III gets first, Final Fantasy II gets second, and Final Fantasy I gets third. Now we move on to gameplay as a whole. The first three Final Fantasy games had a very straightforward gameplay, because they had to. However, it grew more advanced as the series progressed. Final Fantasy II added the code word memorization system, which did not see as much use as it should have, and it was annoying to use. In addition, items could no longer be stacked, key items took up most of your limited item space, and they never left, and there are now hidden rooms, which were usually a waste of time to find. And there were trap rooms that you usually had to check, because they might contain treasure or a staircase. Most of the time, though, they just contain monsters. Fun. On the plus side, you could dual wield weapons, except that didn't work. And the characters weren't limited to what weapons and magic they could equip. In fact, the more you had a character do something, the better they got at it. It was such a great system. At least in theory. It sucked, horrendously so. There were monsters and chests now, which was a nice boost to difficulty. You could also save anywhere on the world map. This was probably the best feature to come out of the game, that and not being limited to 8 slots for weapons and armor per character. And characters could join and leave the party, adding to the aforementioned story. Magic points as opposed to magic levels were nice, but the series wasn't ready for it yet. And there were chocobos. Somewhere, I think. Final Fantasy III went back to the series' roots and improved on them. Character classes were back, but there were more of them, and that's why I love this game so much. There are so many ways to experiment with what character class you want, and setting up your party and assigning classes to each character was a lot of fun to figure out what you wanted each character to have. And at long last, the shop showed what you could and couldn't equip. Chocobos were better integrated, and one could even hold extra items for you. Key items left your inventory when they weren't needed anymore, and items could stack again. There were even 2 side quests to complete, and the class of the character on the world map could interact with things in different ways. For example, a thief could pick locks and... oh, that's it. At least it brought back party members joining and leaving the party. Except they were useless. And the airships were annoying to control, and they functioned really weirdly, and it wasn't perfect, but it was the top of its series at its debut. Final Fantasy III gets first here, and I think Final Fantasy II made more disprovements than improvements, and so Final Fantasy I gets second, leaving Final Fantasy II in third. Next, we head into the nitty-gritty, magic balance. In Final Fantasy I, the magic is helpful until mid-game, where it starts to become less effective. By endgame, Black Wizards are almost obsolete, except for the fast spell. But magic is easily obtainable and affordable, so it's good there. Final Fantasy II introduced a skill-based system, and this applied to magic. Gaining magic points only applied to magic used in battle, while magic could grow stronger outside of battle. This ruined white magic, as it became way too powerful in comparison to the amount of magic points you had. In addition, there was way too much magic. Most of it was useless, and for a new player trying to figure it out, it prevented them from growing any of it to a useful power. While most enemies that were weak to magic could easily be dispelled by physical attacks, there were some that could not. This meant that you had to use your magic that you otherwise wouldn't, and as a result, these foes are tougher than they should be. This system led to super weak magic, and magic points that couldn't be maintained. In addition, casting magic on multiple foes led it to being 1/8 as effective, regardless of how many foes or allies were targeted. Magic is also super expensive, though it can be collected from enemies. Yet usually it just ends up cluttering up inventory space while you wait to sell it. Final Fantasy III brought the game back to a leveled magic system. After the magic failure from Final Fantasy II, I don't blame the developers for doing this. They also narrowed down the amount of magic, and most of the spells in the game were at least semi-useful. Summon magic was also introduced, and it was a blast to use. My only complaint is that the magic was a little hard to find. That being said, Final Fantasy III gets first, Final Fantasy I gets second, and Final Fantasy II gets last. In a similar vein, let's talk about how balanced the battles are. The battles in Final Fantasy I were very balanced. There were a couple of monsters that were not worth fighting, but it was doable to defeat them. All the classes are unique and provide their own benefits. The only difficulty in this game is knowing when you need to warp out of a dungeon and go heal your people. The first battle in Final Fantasy II is unwinnable, but that being said, it has the story to back it up. There are a couple of enemies that you essentially had to know the weakness to finish the fight, which was annoying. The difficulty in this game is deciding whether or not to grind until you have maximum stats, at which point the game isn't that difficult anymore. The balance in this game is really off. For the majority of Final Fantasy III, the balance feels fine. It feels easy, but you have to watch your HP at some parts. However, the beginning and end of the game were stupidly difficult. I won't spoil details, but essentially the last dungeon was not fun at all. It took me at least an hour to beat a couple of the bosses. There are also battles that are just unwinnable for some dumb story reason. But all the classes in the game had something unique to try out, even if most of the abilities were heavily overshadowed by their classes. With this in mind, Final Fantasy I gets first, Final Fantasy III gets second, and Final Fantasy II gets last. Looks like the classic Final Fantasy I is tied with Final Fantasy II, but it's still anybody's game. It's time to push these games to their limit and talk about how convenient they are. Final Fantasy I's weapon and armor system was inconvenient to work with, and developers were trolls and put garbage weapons in later dungeons that you had to drop high-level equipment to see what it was. You can only buy items one at a time, which is incredibly time-consuming, especially with potions. Final Fantasy II is inconvenient enough to make me write a 100-page essay on, but we don't have time for that, so let me summarize a few key points. Items can't stack, item space is too limited, key items never leave your inventory, too many useless spells, the magic system doesn't work, heck, the whole skill system doesn't work, you can only attack the front two rows of enemies. The best sword in the game is in a hidden area, and there are too many hidden areas that are impossible to find. Sorry about that. Final Fantasy III essentially fixed everything that sucked about the first two. My only problem with Final Fantasy III is that the airships are hard to control, and they're very different from all the other airships in the series up to this point. Final Fantasy III unsurprisingly gets first, Final Fantasy I gets second, and Final Fantasy II gets third. What's this? Final Fantasy I has actually passed Final Fantasy II. How much did I actually enjoy playing them though? Final Fantasy I has a very consistent difficulty level and feels balanced the whole way through. I also have a lot of nostalgia for this game as it was the only one of the three released in the United States. Final Fantasy II's story was fun to experience, but the constantly full inventory as well as the two best weapons being hidden from the player made chunks of the game a struggle to play through. Final Fantasy III's class system was a blast to play around with. The game made using a class for the first time easy by telling you what items a character could equip in shops and in the menu. Chocobos were fun to use, and the fat chocobo tried to solve the inventory clutter issue. But the last dungeon wasn't fun. Once you're there, you're stuck, and all the bosses there were excruciating to defeat. Final Fantasy I wins here, Final Fantasy III gets second, and Final Fantasy II gets last. Next, I'll discuss how important these games were to the series and industry as a whole. Final Fantasy I was one of the first video game RPGs to be released in Japan. It was made only after Dragon Quest proved that it could be done. Final Fantasy was heavily inspired by D&D, and while some may say that that was uncreative, it was one of, if not the first RPGs to apply that logic that we think is standard today. Zombies being weak to fire and fire monsters being weak to ice was rarely implemented prior to Final Fantasy I. It was also one of the first to let players create their own characters. As the basis for the second most popular RPG series in Japan, and perhaps the most popular JRPG series in America, I'd say it's pretty important. Final Fantasy II, on the other hand, was a bit different. It was never released in America and was considerably more original than the first game. Players couldn't create a character in the traditional sense, but their actions as the game progressed would build the characters. It looks a lot like later Final Fantasy games, but couldn't pull off the mechanics at the time. Final Fantasy III was one of the most advanced RPGs to be released at its time. Its cartridge was so full that it didn't have room for the new graphics required for translation, and thus was never translated. It was the first game to have class changing, and an auto-retarget system for battle. It also introduced unique battle commands like summon and jump. With all this in mind, I think Final Fantasy I gets first, and because Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III both added important features to the series, I think they tie for second. And now it's time for our last category. How polished are these games? Final Fantasy I had a lot of things that just didn't work properly under the hood. Many stats did nothing, and many weapons and spells didn't work as intended. And some translations are off. In one spot, a guy talks about probing for a floater. Yuck. Final Fantasy II is very broken. The character development system is abusable, some weapons don't work properly, characters aren't attacked properly, dual wielding doesn't work, several stats can overflow, etc. Yikes. Final Fantasy III is less broken, though a couple items don't work properly, and there's a glitch that lets you obtain the strongest gear at the start of the game. I'd say Final Fantasy III is the most polished. Final Fantasy I takes second, Final Fantasy II takes third. So our final scoring is Final Fantasy III with 26 points, Final Fantasy I with 20 points, and Final Fantasy II with 15 points. This means Final Fantasy III is our winner. Remember, I was only ranking the original version of the game. Many of the remakes fix a lot of these issues. Let me know if you have any more categories you think I could use to rank them in the comments. Would you have ranked them differently? Let me know. Anyway, that's all for now. I'll see you guys in 2 years when I make my next video. I'm joking.